morning, everyone, and welcome to Room 42. I'm Liz Fraley from Single Sourcing Solutions. I'll be your moderator today. This is Janice Summers, our interview, and welcome Kirk St.Amant, today's guest in Room 42. Kirk is a professor, the Eunice C. Williamson Endowed Chair for Technical Communication, and the director of the newly formed Center for Health and Medical Communication at Louisiana Tech University. He's here to help us start answering the question, how do concepts from psychology, usability, design, and intercultural communication help us identify usability expectations in different contexts? Welcome, Kirk.
Thank you for having me, Liz. Thank you for having me, Janice. Looking forward to our discussion.
Oh, I am so excited to be talking to you. This is just like absolutely exciting, and I have so many questions for you.
I'll do my best.
Well, and I'm going to try to get through. You've got so much information that you can share that I'm going to try to keep us kind of focused, and I hope you'll come back again because I don't think we're going to be able to get to everything, but we're going to try our best.
Okay.
So let's get started. Scalable usability. What is that? How did you come up with that phrase?
Sure.
What inspired you for that?
It was actually in looking at localization and customization, if you will.
Okay.
And so, for example, I do a lot of work with engineers, particularly biomedical engineers right now.
Okay.
And it's looking at whenever you design a technology for someone, for example, their default in how to use things is based on their personal experiences.
Right.
And so the more you can customize something to meet the previous experiences and expectations of the specific individual, the more readily they can use it because their expectations have been met. They can look at it and reflexively, they know what it is, they know what it does, and they know how to use it. I was just thinking in terms of that, we were also talking about international communication at the same time and localization. And the notion of, well, with localization, the idea is you don't treat an entire cultural group like a gigantic monolith, but you try to figure out that specific group. What are their experiences that have shaped their expectations for how to recognize things, how to use things, and how to operate them? And at that point, it kind of struck me, well, we're talking about the same thing. Whether it's ultimate individualized customization or localization, we're basically dealing with the continuum of how closely we try to meet the specific expectations of someone based on their experiences, because those shape the mental models or the cognitive processes they use to interact with devices or life around them. And so that's where the idea came from, is this notion of if you start with the individual, total individualized customization as the beginning point, how far out can you scope or scale back? And what range of experiences do you take into account to try to meet the expectations of needs of individuals as shaped by their experiences?
Okay, so taking it from the perspective of the end user rather than the engineer's own personal biases.
Yes.
Now, how would they gain that knowledge of the end users?
Great question.
Engineers don't often interface with a lot of people.
Right.
Right.
And I suppose that's where folks like myself and some other colleagues in in cognitive psychology from my university and other areas have come in. And there's the recognition that you've got to understand the human element, what the human user expects and needs before you build something for them. So like the classic line, if you build it, they will come, from Field of Dreams.
Yes.
This notion of if you build it, they will use it. No. The idea, we need to know, what do they need? What do they expect? That determines whether they use. And so it's a matter of getting folks to actually sit down with the people you're designing something for and figure out what do they expect. What do you expect a blood pressure gauge to look like versus have me design it for you and hope that you know what it is. When you know what it looks like, well, how do you expect to use it based upon your experiences? Rather than me kind of put some switches on it and hope you can intuit your way through it, your experiences might have taught you what to look for in that design. And so it's essentially building from the user back to the engineer. Here is what the user looks for when they pick a device up. This is what they need to know to recognize it. This is what they look for to operate it. And most importantly, the context they're in dictates what they will do with it. So here is where they tend to be when they use it, which governs what they look for and how they operate something. Classic example, you and I might both check our blood pressure using a like a wrist gauge in our
Right.
kitchens. But you're checking your blood pressure at the very start of the day when you're the only person awake and have all the time in the world. So the degree of attention you can pay to fine detail of designs of devices is quite high. I might be doing the same thing in my kitchen at the end of the day after picking up my kids from school and preparing dinner for them. In that context, my attention is in a dozen different places. And so when I come to operate that same device, the context where I'm using it needs to be addressed to make sure I don't make a mistake, because my attention is being shifted continually while I use it. So it's looking at those dynamics, if you will.
Okay. So now, intercultural communication. Now, can you just define that for me? How would you define?
Sure. I'm going to start with the abstract textbooky kind of thing, and then talk about a more pragmatic.
Yes.
So quite often you hear culture defined as a worldview. And a worldview basically is this group of individuals determines what is important to them and their group, which is essential for them to pay attention to and value, or pay attention to and avoid, because it's related to their survival. So that's kind of the fundamental thing when we talk about a culture at a very brass tacks level, if you will. From a more pragmatic, let's say, cognitive psychological perspective, it goes to attention and what you pay attention to. So it kind of works something like this. Our brains cannot effectively process all the information our senses bring in at one time. There's too much data coming in that our brain can process. And we've all experienced sensory overload. There's too much going on. I don't know what to do. I've got to shut down. To avoid living in a state of that, our culture teaches us what are these sensory impulses to pay attention to. And that's key, because it tells us what to separate out from the environment around us and focus on
what's important.
Yes, ma'am. It's called perceptual segregation in cognitive psychology. But built into that perceptual segregation is this concept of scope and scale. For example, if I do this, and you say, well, what do I look at? Do I look at the shirt? Do I look at the buttons? Do I look at the collar, the weave? I say, look at the hand. Just focus on the hand. And suddenly everything else goes away. And then you might ask, well, do I focus on the individual digits? Do I focus on the creases, the veins, the fingernails? And culture will say, no, just look at the hand. All that matters is the hand. At some point, the fingernails may become relevant and will tell you to focus on them. But for now, just focus on the hand. Okay, now that it has your focus, what does it do? Well, we use it to reach out to greet someone, or we use it to reach around to hold something. But the idea is what culture essentially does in this worldview format is tells you of all the sensory data you're taking in. Here's what to pay attention to. And once your attention is focused, here's what it is, here's what it does, and here's how you use it in this specific set of contexts that occur in our culture. Or if you will, we're going to call that recognition, categorization, and operationalization. I can identify it, I know what it can do, and I know in the specific setting I'm in right now, which of those potential uses to apply to make it work or to use it.
And those things are, how different are they for cultures, or is there a lot of commonality?
I mean,
across boundaries. I mean, the whole concept of boundaries has shifted, hasn't it?
I mean, a lot of these factors are based upon exposure over time. I mean, we're taught either actively someone tells us pay attention to this, or passively we see other members of our group paying attention to something and learn it's got some sort of merit, whether it's valued or not. And the more physical separation that occurred historically, the easier it was for two different groups to diverge and remain in divergence around what they pay attention to. Now, all of that changes the moment you're exposed to something else. And so with modern telecommunications, particularly the internet, the more we can interact with other individuals, the more we can see what individuals from different regions, nations, and cultures, what they're doing, how they design, the more we can expand our understanding to incorporate those factors. And so, culture isn't a fixed entity. It's always in a state of flux, depending upon who you're interacting with, what the nature of the interaction is, when it is happening. All those things cause that flux to progress over time.
And how do you compensate for that in design?
In design, again, we go back to the individual user. Okay, and it comes down to who are you, where are you, and what are you trying to do? And I mean, those are key. you might have the knowledge to operate a specific technology, but the context you're in does not have, let's say, a readily available power source that allows the technology that we want to give you to be powered. In that case, we need something else. Or you might be in an environment that permits you to use this technology, but you don't have the knowledge because the educational system you were in did not provide you with that knowledge. So it's a matter of going back to, who are we designing this for? Regardless of the culture that they are in, who are they? Where are they located? And what are they trying to do? And working with members of that group, asking them these questions. What are you trying to do? What do you usually use to do this? What does this process usually entail? If you're using something else, what is it and how do you use it? What factors in the environment where you are affect how you do something? It's getting that level of detail to figure out literally how people are engaging in this perceptual segregation, what they look for and look at to identify things, use them, and figure out what to do in a context.
Now, how are you assessing all of this? Are you doing in-depth interviews? Are you using online tools for this? How are you capturing all of that information straight from an end user?
It's a multi-part process. So, I mean, you begin with both interviews and focus groups. And the idea is, with the interview, you get that individual, in-depth, one-on-one information from the person, but we're all fallible. We'll forget things. So you balance it with focus groups so that when the group begins to respond, as a group, they tend to fit in parts, put in parts and pieces that might have been omitted. And so you take that initial data from individuals and focus groups, and you use it to come up with a prototype design.
Right.
And I should point out, during these things, since we're talking about the design of something, it's always important to either sketch out or create some sort of representation as folks are talking and have them clarify. So when you say, for example, it's a remote control, begin the drawing it out, something that looks like this or something slightly differently. But the idea is you aggregate this data and look for trends in it across people. And across this group, these seem to be the features this technology needs to have for people to know what it is, identification. More importantly, these features need to be configured in this way or put in these places on the interface so they know what it does, categorization. And then we also need to be asking them, well, where are you using this thing? So we can make sure they can find it in a pinch if needed. How many of us reflexively use a remote control by touch because we know where it is and know how to find it? That operationalization. And so based upon that, you come up with a wireframe or an initial prototype design that you then go back to members of this audience and you test with. And it's brute force questions. Do you recognize what this is? Tell me what it does. How would you use it? Okay, talk me through the process you would engage in to use it. If it's a functioning prototype, I'd like you to use this design to perform this task. I'd like you to use this prototype remote control to turn on the TV set. And key to this approach are talk aloud or think aloud protocols. I want to observe what you're doing, but please tell me what you are doing, why, and what your initial reactions are as you're going through a process. And you collect that data from these initial tests. And again, we're talking both with individuals and focus groups, time and resources permitting. You revise that design and ideally test again. Now, I'm presenting an idealized situation.
Yeah.
Where there are no parameters. And so for the practitioner, the question becomes, how much time and how much money do we have to dedicate to this? We know that at a minimum, we must gain data or initial input from the population we're designing for.
Right.
And we know we've got to do at least one round of testing, because me guessing at what you want is always a dangerous thing. And so based upon those parameters, what is a reasonable number of interviews or focus groups? What is a reasonable level of time and money to put into developing a prototype to test? What kind of testing do we wish to engage in? All of that is governed by those real world factors of time and resources, or time and money, if you will.
So the more testing that you do, is there a greater success?
Theoretically, yes. I mean, you want to get to the perfect point where people look at it and reflexively they can do and use.
Right.
That's very difficult. And so you've also, thank you for mentioning it, in this process, got to create a threshold. Right. What is the level at which we'll find it's acceptable now? Most people can perform most of the functions that are essential. And functions that either cannot be performed or are performed problematically are not so detrimental that they'll cause some sort of problem that can't be undone.
Right.
So again, this is the beginning of the process, is setting these parameters.
Right.
And then once you've set the parameters, figuring out how to select test subjects, how to engage in this kind of data collection, how to do this kind of initial user testing, how to do the revision process.
Right. Now, can you start with like work that's already been done and then build from that?
Definitely.
Is there like a way that you could borrow somebody else's research on a related type of thing and apply it?
Sure. I mean, one of the interesting things is most of us are accustomed to using a range of things. And so whenever we create something quote unquote new, we're not building something that's never existed before for the most part. We're creating a one-off of something or a modification of something that already exists. And so in that case, it's a matter of, if we take stuff that people can already recognize,
right,
what are some modifications we can make to it and then try it with the sample of the test audience to see if they can understand it. We all know how apps on a phone work, on an iPhone work, or a smartphone work. And so it's a matter of, we don't need to get into designing a smartphone. So based upon that, what should our app look like so people can recognize it on a phone?
right,
How does our app need to respond so when they tap it once or twice like they would a conventional app, we know it's responding accordingly? So we can use existing products that mirror what we're trying to do, and to a fair level of safety, I guess that there's going to be some parallelism there. Let's call this analogous design. We design something based on a pre-existing thing that folks already know how to use,
right,
because they've got built into their mental hardware a method for using it. So it's just a matter of writing that existing reflexive behavior to an objective.
Right. If you use a calculator, you can use your phone.
Exactly.
Right. The keyboard's the same. The same if you have the math part on your keyboard, right? They're the same thing. So if you're just going to vary it a little bit, then you can safely assume and just test from that aspect. So you can build from what's already been done.
Yes, ma'am.
What if you have no exposure to your end users? Like, there are situations where people just don't have exposure to end users. So what could somebody in that situation do?
Well, let's take this from, I guess, a two-part approach. So, but there's no exposure. It's one thing to say there's no ability to physically interact with somebody.
Right.
But
like they can't interview their customer. They have no connection with their customer. Yeah. Like, they're not allowed. There's gatekeepers.
Right. So, I mean, in that case, the question becomes, if it's an organizational perspective, how does the organization create an initiative that the gatekeepers who are involved realize it's in their benefit to participate in this process and to provide some degree of access to this population? Now, at some point, the organization will have to make a decision. If the gatekeeper is a third party, do we want to let that third party do this kind of research for us? Or do we want the third party's permission, ability, whatever you want to call it, to interact with this population directly? And so those are things to sort of negotiate there within. So that's kind of one way of doing it. The second way is, there are certain bands of, for consumer sake, certain bands of consumer different categorizations folks fall into. And you could sort of get into it by saying, we just need consumers from this particular bandwidth or this particular background. So maybe we'll do something as simple as, on our website, put out a call for these many individuals. Or through our social media platforms, put out a call for this many individuals for research. But it's simply a matter of, without having access to the people you're designing for, the ability to guess at their expectations is kind of difficult at a minimum, and could be dangerous in some cases, particularly if it's in instances of life and death.
Can't mess around in those situations. It's hard to run a prototype if you're testing like ambulance technology, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
how do you measure usability and consumer customer expectations?
Sure. Well, you can do it a couple of different ways. And from like a very beta stage, you can do things like pre and post testing to show just brute force customer satisfaction. Before the creation of our product, these were the completion rates and completion times for this task. either using a pre-existing product or with no product to fill the gap at all. Using our revised product or this new product, there's a decrease in completion time and an increase in success rate. So that could be one marker. And that's something you can measure more directly. But then there are things like follow-up interviews that check satisfaction level and adoption rate. Or so satisfaction level, did you enjoy this process? Would you use this technology again? Adoption metrics, would you recommend this technology to a friend, family member, coworker, client? But measuring those two kinds of data to figure out the usability will guide the marketability of it in many cases. So since word of mouth and social media marketing are so important now, effective usability that encourages individuals to want to share information about something with someone can be very valuable. So from my perspective, it's not thinking about usability as this extra thing, but it is an integrated part of the process that affects the design, the development, the marketing, all of it, because it's all interconnected.
Right. Were there any things that you intuited and were completely surprised at the end results when you measured usability at the back end?
Yes. I'm going to sound like a geek for a second.
That's okay.
So we all take in information through different senses.
Yeah.
And some of us have a primacy sense. For those of us who are sighted, our sense of vision is our primary sense of doing things.
Yeah.
Because of that, we tend to forget that whenever we process information, we take it in through all channels at the same time.
Yes.
And so working with
the
users...
difference between being on the phone or being face-to-face.
Exactly.
A good example, yeah.
But you don't realize how important non-visual factors are to usability until someone brings them to your attention. So I've talked a lot about we draw this, or we sketch this, or we sketch this. At some point, someone's got to ask, well, what does it feel like to hold in your hand?
Yeah.
And we found this out in terms of when you interact with individuals who are visually impaired.
Yes.
They might not, they've got a different primary sense that they will use to recognize something. It's not what it looks like. It might be what it feels like or what it sounds like. Well, it turns out we all recognize many of those same cues. We just have relegated them further back in our cognitive processes because we don't realize they're as important as they are. So it's realizing not only is it important for me to create an effective, let's say, pen that I recognize when I see it, but when I pick it up and feel it, it feels it's got the right proportions, heft, substance to it, that it's a good pen. And it sounds right. So when I use it, I know it's operating correctly.
Right.
So the big surprise there was usability is multi-channel. And it's whenever you do collect this kind of data, it involves more than simply asking, what does it look like? But it's what does it feel like? What does it sound like? Whenever
Taking all the senses into consideration.
Yes, ma'am.
In the usability. Yes.
When you test, not just, well, do you recognize this? What facets let you recognize it? Does it hold this? Manipulate it? Does it feel correct? Those kinds of things.
Just last week, we had Lisa Melanson, and she talked about her brother-in-law with an iPad in the field and no sink to clean his fingers so that he could operate the iPad.
Right.
And on top of that, he's in a tractor trying to fix the
He's
tractor.
trying to fix something.
But we're back to context. You know, it's one thing to know your user, but you got to know where they're using something.
Yes.
You know, that becomes key. There's a joke about like the manuals that are used to do everything from open heart surgery to, say, diffuse a landmine.
Right.
And it's always the point at where the individuals get both hands on something, and if they let go, chaos will happen. Then you see turn page. You know, and so it's always about, well, no, where are people using this thing? And I think that's one thing that when folks begin to think about scaling for usability, it's you scale for the context where something is used, as well as the individual who's using it.
So in compensating for that context, because that's where you can have huge variations, right?
Definitely.
Right. You talked about earlier the person, like if I'm taking my blood pressure in the morning and I'm relaxed, nobody's up, and I'm doing it before I'm having coffee.
Right.
Right. And I have plenty of time. Whereas if, you know, the kids are up and I'm making dinner and everything's chaos and hectic, I have very little bandwidth. I've only got so many bytes per second that I'm going to process. And I don't have a lot of time devoted to interfacing with this equipment.
Right.
So the context, but that's a huge swing in context. How do you figure out where to target? Because you can't hit everybody. You can't aim for everyone.
Great question. And I mean, this is where it comes down to, it's got to be user testing in context. So for example, when we collect data, because that's one of the questions to always ask is, where is this used and when? Because the time dynamic will affect what is going on in that space. Like we mentioned, before breakfast or in the middle of making a meal. So when and where? And then it's identifying, when we do initial interviews and focus groups, asking these questions. Where would you use this technology? When would you use it? What is going on in that space? Who is there? What is happening while you're using this process? Excuse me, but then it involves user testing it, ideally in that location. So back to, you mentioned the iPad in the field. It's not a matter of you bring in farmers to a controlled location like a laboratory setting, give them an iPad and do it. No. You go out to the field and you ask the person on the tractor to please stop. Can you try to do this right now? Now that does get tricky, and that's where you need to think about, we're back to time and resources. How do we do this? Do we mail them the iPad and ask them, like, on their honor to use it and return it? Do we find that if they've already got an iPad, put the app on it and ask them to include it in their daily routine? But if you're not testing in context, you're not going to get the full range of different, what are often called affordances or constraints that affect how people use things, and that's what's going to be key.
Right. Now, what about, are there times where you have to fill in the blank and make your best guess, your best educated guess? Like, assuming, like, we all have a pre-concept of a farmer's life, right? We've pretty much seen or heard movies, right, at this point in our lives. So everyone has kind of a general sense of what the life of a farmer is on a tractor. So we have this idea of it. Is it okay sometimes to fill in the blank with, like, writing a feature film and imagining this character and all this character is going through to help fill in some of these blanks? Because in a practitioner's world, I can see where a lot of that analysis time is not given to them. It just isn't, and it won't change. So for a practitioner, what do you recommend they could do to try and solve that? Because it's an important factor. It really is in design.
So you've raised some excellent points and excellent questions. I'll do my best to try to talk about each of them.
Sure.
So in terms of the pragmatics, when can you sort of bridge the gap, or when can you, like, let your own sort of movie that you've created do stuff? Well, it comes down to, what is your objective and what is the user's objective? So, I mean, you mentioned a movie, so let's start there. A movie is designed to entertain. So its ability to reflect reality, you can take, artistic parameters with it. Me creating an app that's designed to help people share their videos of themselves lip syncing songs on an online platform. Well, I can roughly kind of guess at what that is, because any sort of adverse effect that might come out of it, in theory, should be mitigated. Or at least the level of damage or danger that could occur. Now, we can talk about what does that mean in terms of requiring age checks of individuals before they post things. That's a different element. But in theory, the level of danger is limited. Now let's take something like a drug dispensing device that individuals are supposed to operate on their own. You're talking about something where if the individual doesn't use it effectively, there will be severe harm, if not death, that results from it. In those cases, you really cannot take the risk that a guess at something. So again, we're back to that scalability. When you are scoping this process, what is the scope that you are dealing with? Is it entertainment? Is it some sort of professional function that's associated with production, with sales, with legal compliance? Is it designed to monitor a health condition? Is it desired to save a life? That's kind of, we're back to that context. What is the context this is going to be used in? And so that becomes important. To your question of, so how do you research this? We're at a stage now where the complexity of these kinds of issues is not something personally I think one individual, one organization, or a small group can do. This is literally talking about a community involvement project. So it's a matter of, well, if I'm an educator and you work in industry. What are some things we could collaborate on so I could use students working in, say, one of my classes to conduct some of this research as they learn about it that could be of benefit to you and your organization, for which maybe the students could get, say, internship credit?
Right.
How could you partner with professional organizations in the field to say, would you consider having members work on this project? And here might be something that we can provide in exchange, maybe access to some of our professional development materials.
Yes.
But we're at a point now where we need to start thinking about effective collaborations
Yes.
to engage in this kind of work, because I think it's two things. It's very difficult to do independently,
Mm-hmm.
but second, we need to be sharing this information for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If it's not a proprietary thing and it's not something that involves the disclosure of some sort of specific trade secret or benefit,
Mm-hmm.
if it's just about human behavior with certain things, to what levels can we share this information? Because it does all of us good.
Right, right, exactly. And you brought up a really good point, which I always like to encourage practitioners to get involved with professors at universities and engage students on things. Like, you might not have the budget, you often don't have the bandwidth. I mean, let's face it. In the commercial world, there's not a whole lot of bandwidth for research, whereas in academia, there is. And there happens to be a lot of hungry students that are eager to learn and more than happy to engage in doing work that helps them strengthen their skills.
Real projects, not just fake things
Not
that
just
don't
make
mean
up-
anything.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the more professors we talk to, we're hearing this common thing. It's like, hey, we'd be more than happy to entertain projects that the commercial industry needs help on. We're happy to do them, right? I've got plenty of students to throw at projects. So I just want to reinforce that for everybody who might have missed that, who is a practitioner.
For sure.
Well, can I put one thing out there while we're talking about this?
Sure.
So one of the odd fringe benefits of the current social situation where all of us have lived online for a very long time is the need to be in physical proximity with someone to engage in these interactions. We've begun to realize we can do a lot more virtually than we realized. And so when it comes to forging these partnerships, now's a very opportune time to reach out across the country if need be and find someone who can help in a class in different places who can help. Because a lot of the stuff we're talking about can be done online.
Yes.
I mean, I don't necessarily have to go to every farm field. If I can get a decent Zoom connection out to that farm field to test the farmer who is out there operating something.
Yeah.
So it's how do we leverage this new comfort or familiarity with online exchanges to kind of maximize this ability to interact and collect this kind of data, to experience things.
Yeah. Not just across the country, but around the world.
Yes, ma'am.
Right? I mean,
all those contexts.
It's a globally connected world because we're in this global situation where it's become quite obvious the benefits of being globally connected. And I think this is a rare opportunity that we should capitalize on, this opportunity to connect with people all around the world in new and different ways and keep that connection going. Okay.
Can we go back to one other thing real quick before I forget?
Please. Yes, please.
So you were mentioning about at what point can you sort of guess at things?
Right.
And so here's something we've seen very close to literally home here in Louisiana, proper nutrition for individuals. Now, we have a pretty solid idea of what proper nutrition entails. And we know that there are certain kinds of foods that people should or should not eat. And the things that they should or should not cook, and how to cook and prepare these things and those sorts of things. So it's very easy, let's say, to come up with a recipe guide for individuals on certain levels of budgets to try to purchase the kind of food and cook the kind of food that's needed to maintain a healthy lifestyle, let's say.
Right.
For your heart health. Great. What we've noticed here, and again, this is stuff that should be fairly self-obvious, one would think. And as long as you provide people with reasonable expectations based upon what we know how people operate, it should work. Well, one of the things we've discovered here is those recipes don't necessarily work because of something called food deserts. Yeah. And that is that a lot of that is predicated on the fact you have access to a grocery store. Yeah. What happens if you're in the small rural community where the only food source you can walk to, because you might be elderly or there might be some other reason you cannot use a car or there's no public transportation, you have to walk to the dollar store, which is the only source of food in that region. That's a whole different kind of
Yes.
nutritional content available to you. What if you're in an urban area and the only source of food that you can actually get to pragmatically is a gas station? I'm not being glib with this. These are actual situations.
No, it's real. It's a reality.
But it's realizing that these menus that seem so self-obvious, because they're based upon things we've understood for a very long time, it's advocated by the right groups. The moment you put them into a certain context, they are not usable. Not because the information behind them necessarily is flawed, and not necessarily because the users for whom they're designed can't understand or will push back against it. It's simply the physical realities of where people are using things do not align with the content. And so we're back to this. It's fine to kind of try to speculate at certain things, but again, what are you talking about and what does it mean? Because in many ways, you mentioned what were discoveries you made. This is one of those discoveries where you don't realize, wow, context really binds the usability of something simply by what is actually available. And so those kinds of recognitions are always important to make sure by beginning with asking the user, well, what's the context you're in? That was my digression. So.
No, it's good.
And what's the context this is going to use? And food is
That's
like
a
a whole,
good example.
food's like a whole, there's so much information about food that goes this way and that way. And yeah. Okay. So, I'm trying to pick up.
Yeah, we got a lot of questions in
There are a
registration.
lot. There are a lot, and I'm trying to get through a lot of them and a lot of what I wanted to talk to you about as well. But yeah. Oh, okay. Let's go down to this one. So technical writers specifically. So we're talking about users and engineers from a technical writer's perspective. By now, we have to now take this complex thing and we have to communicate this complexity in a simple way. So we usually do not have a lot of exposure, and oftentimes, sadly, it's not often like we don't often have a seat at the design table.
Right.
Now we're left with the situation where we have to explain this complexity, and we're seeing usability issues as we're writing. How do we address that, and what can a technical writer do to infuse this whole concept of scalable usability in our writing practice? How do we get that going from, it's almost like the bottom up, for lack of a better phrase?
Sure. So there are a couple of different things to do. And the first is, earlier I talked about this concept of pre-testing and post-testing. So in many cases, forcing your way to the table is showing you add value. And so the question becomes, well, how do technical writers add value? Let's have these individuals try to operate this device in one of three ways. Let's have them operate the thing that you've created with no instruction. And let's see what happens. Again, let's measure completion rates, completion times, satisfaction levels, and adoption rates. Now let's take, I've tried to create instruction on how to use the thing. Let's have them use it again and try this again. Different individuals, but same target audience. Now let's try it a third way. Let me, based upon how I understand audience to work, let me propose a design. And using this proposed design, let's try it again. And let's measure those variables. Now, this is just kind of an idealized situation, but theoretically, you could show relatively quickly that there is an increase in usability, and more importantly, an increase in satisfaction and adoption rates for certain things. And if we can argue that that's market share, because we know at this point in time that markets roll very quickly, competition is high, and the ease of use can be the key to cracking it. So can technical writers use this kind of an exercise to demonstrate to individuals in their organizations that no, actually we contribute a huge amount of value, not just in allowing people to use designs that might need enhancing, but in being part of the design process from the very beginning, because we understand audience and user, and we can do this kind of research. So that's one approach to begin sort of making those inroads. Another approach, which you can test with, as kind of a party trick, if you will, but you can test with folks, is whenever we write, we do an odd thing. What we do is, like I tell you, Janice, could you write an instruction manual on how to use Slack? So your mind is going to do a couple of things very quickly. Since you're sighted, it's going to pop up an image of what an instruction manual is. And that visual representation of instruction manual is going to be crazily detailed. Like, you can tell me what the pages will look like, their layout and design. You can tell me will it be perfect bound or staple bound. You can tell me the number, all that jazz, because you've got this mental default that says manual. But you've also got a mental default, let's call it not a picture but a video, of what the process of using Slack looks like. So whenever you write, you use words to describe that thing you see in your mental video to create the thing you see in that mental picture, and that's how you write something up. When I read it, the onus for me as the reader is to reverse that process. I've got to take the thing you've given me, and first of all, I've got to recognize it. Is this really an instruction manual, or is this just some ancillary stuff I put aside? But then when I read your words, I've got to recreate that mental video that you wrote about as close as to what you had as possible to understand what you're writing and use the thing. If those two things don't align, we are going to have massive problems. Now, parlor trick part. Have somebody write a set of instructions on how to tie their shoes. And then give it to someone else at the same party and say, do not fill in any blanks. Do literally what that person just wrote down. And you can see very quickly this ability to, this transfer of idea to individual back into idea, you can begin to see how it breaks down. Now, I bring that up because we're cited, I mentioned visuals. Again, depending upon the primary sensory channel used by the individual, it could be sounds, it could be positioning, it could be tactition. But there's a mental model that guides what we describe whenever we speak or write. And it's what we unpack and try to recreate mentally to conceptualize what someone is writing or talking about. And by using little tricks like this, by helping individuals realize there's a lot more going on here than we understand. And these folks actually understand it. And they seem to know what is taken to get the right picture to describe when they write, or the right sensory imprint to recreate when they build something. They need to be a part of this design process. Those sound both very like simplistic tasks, but the power one can generate just by showing these kinds of things and very quickly can really make the right people aware that there's a lot of value that can go into understanding the user we're creating for before we even build something. And since you know this concept of user and audience and how people use things, you should be involved in this process.
Right.
So that's my soapbox speech.
Right. But if you're not involved in the process, then how would you report back usability? Because you're not involved in that for whatever reason. Because organizations have dynamics of their own. Right.
This is where that partnership we talked about between industry and academia can be really interesting. So you can't get inroads into your company to do something. So you ask my class to user test this new app they've just built. And then one of the things we can build into this relationship is my class can email, contact marketing or production or whomever it is, quality control, as a group, and let me talk about all the issues we've encountered using your app. And suddenly it's on an organization's radar. Now, once it's on the radar, the question becomes, well, gee, who do we need to talk about this? That's a case in which if students say as they're rendering these opinions, let people know, we were trying this as part of a class, working with this individual at your organization, if the technical writer feels comfortable being named in that way, or just working with technical communicators at your organization, suddenly you've associated a problem that can be fixed with someone who's aware of the problem and can fix it. And so that is a way to sort of raise that awareness of who in your organization can help with something.
Nice move.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, market share talks. And the more you can sort of explain how you affect market share dynamics, regardless of the channel you use, the more ability you have to speak and be heard, if you will.
Right, right. And I always say that if you're in technical writing and you're not buddies with your marketing department, you really want to be, because marketing has clout. And in this scenario, let's just say that I'm the tech writer and I say, hey, Kirk, can your class just help test this out for me? You could give me that information. I could walk right over to marketing. And I could marketing would get involved if it's a usability thing. So there are different ways Sometimes it's harder to go right over into engineering and say, hey, let me at the table. Sometimes it's easier for marketing to say, oh no, we're at the table. Come on. Right? Because market share talks. Legal ramifications also talk.
Oh yeah, legal's a good friend to have.
Legal
definitely.
is the best group to have as your buddies because they need to protect the company, and especially when you're talking about things in the medical field. Like anybody in the medical field knows that legal is your buddy. Is it really time already?
It really is time already.
Oh, man,
I know we could talk with Kirk all day long.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the chance to chat.
One quick question.
Yeah.
One sarcastic comment, which is just kind of funny. This question came in ahead of time, and I looked at it, I'm like, are they joking? So let's settle the question. Is cognitive psychology applicable in technical writing?
Yes.
Okay.
Just simply because if we're thinking about the things that we're writing about, then we're engaged in the act of cognition.
Yes. And another thing too is if you are involved in minimalism, and if you're involved in data in any way, you're already got cognitive psychology involved in your technical writing, because that was what was leaned into heavily when that architecture was designed and minimalism came to be in tech writing. So, okay, good. Another question that came up that I'm like, okay, are you joking? This question was like, are you joking? Somebody had asked, wasn't cognitive psychology discredited at the end of the 60s?
Great question. There have been certain studies that came out in the 50s and in the 60s that have been either impossible to replicate. The Stanford prison experiment is a good one by Zimbardo, where claims are made about how individuals behave in terms of authority. And apparently, whether or not that it was actually a fake situation or not, you have to ask other individuals about that. But things like that, did it actually happen? And then you've got people like Vickery, who did some of the first studies on subliminal advertising. And his claim was he went to a movie theater and inserted like a slide, we'll call it a slide now, but a frame or a panel of movie film that said something about food, and that drove more people to the snack counters. Became very popular, was put into marketing books in the late 50s. And Vickery later admitted, well, I didn't actually do the study.
Right.
So you do have things like, that come up. Now, with that said, I'm almost done. The whole key to all of this is cog-psych valid or not comes down to replicability.
Right.
Can people replicate the results effectively and over time? And if so, then there's a good chance that what they're talking about is useful.
Right.
But if not, maybe not. One final thing on that, because this came up during this current situation we're in. Last month, a group of researchers from Duke published a study that showed that fMRIs, functioning MRI machines, the results that were showing up in relation to those studies might not be as effective as people thought they were. Because while MRIs measure blood flow to the brain, and that's been used to indicate that neural activity is happening in the brain, it turns out when you have the same people try the same process later, they're going to register in many cases a different fMRI. Possibly because since they've seen the topic once before, they don't need as much directed blood flow to the brain to deal with a new topic.
Right,
but we're not quite sure what it means at this time. This is very new. It came out, I believe it was in June.
Right.
So all the research related to fMRIs in cognitive psychology could be suspect to change. I don't know.
Right.
But I mean, these are all things, the question, has it been discredited? Some has, some they keep testing, and some seems to keep working. And that's what it comes down to. Has this been tested?
But I mean, and that's any branch of psychology too.
Yes,
some studies or results that were reported were incorrect and they're being disproven. But that's the study in science as well.
Yes.
Is always prove, disprove, prove, disprove, and the cream rises to the top, right? And it can be proved over and over again, and that we hang on to. So it's not like cognitive psychology as a whole is a bunch of hooey. It's not.
Right.
There are some studies that have not been done correctly. Right. Good. Okay. So We have to go, unfortunately, but I want to have you back. Please say you'll come back.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank y'all for the opportunity to sit and chat. This is fun.
There's so
Thank you
much
for doing
more
this.
we could unpack with you. It's just, this has been great.
Oh,
We
this
do
has been
have
wonderful.
one comment I want to share. Hands
Yeah.
down, best webinar I've been to ever, maybe.
Oh, thanks.
Great.
Oh,
Where do I
know,
send the
we
check
love
for
it.
that comment?
It's awesome.
yeah, right. Where's the check go?
Yeah.
Thanks, Mom.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here and for everybody
you,
sending in
folks.
such really good questions.
Yes, thanks everybody.
have
We'll
you
see
back.
you the
Thank you,
next time in room 42.
Take care. Keep safe.
Long, everyone.
Yes, you too.